A snobbish CEO mocks a poor janitor. Hours later, his life falls apart in the most unthinkable way. Sarah Walker stepped out of her modest apartment building into the bustling streets of downtown. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the city as people hurried to their destinations. Sarah, a dedicated community organizer, had a full day ahead of her, starting with a meeting at the local community center. As she walked, Sarah reflected on the progress they had made in the past year. The community had come together to support one another through tough times, creating a network of resilience and hope. Small acts of kindness, from sharing meals to offering job leads, had made a big difference in people's lives. Sarah arrived at the community center, where she was greeted by a group of volunteers eager to discuss their latest projects. Among them was Carlos Ramirez, a humble janitor who had recently lost his job due to budget cuts at a major corporation. Despite his own struggles, Carlos always found time to help others, embodying the spirit of the community. As the meeting began, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that change was on the horizon. Little did she know, a powerful CEO named Charles Blackwell was about to set in motion a series of events that would transform their lives in unimaginable ways. Charles Blackwell strode into the gleaming headquarters of Blackwell Enterprises, his expensive suit and confident demeanor commanding attention. As CEO, he ruled his company with an iron fist, believing that his wealth and status made him untouchable. In the lobby, Charles spotted a janitor mopping the floor. It was Carlos Ramirez, who had recently found part-time work at the company to make ends meet. Charles approached Carlos, a sneer on his face. "You missed a spot," Charles said, pointing to an imaginary stain on the floor. "I expect perfection from everyone who works for me, even the lowly janitors." Carlos looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of humility and determination. "I apologize, sir. I'll make sure to double-check my work." Charles scoffed. "See that you do. I don't tolerate mediocrity in my company." With that, Charles turned on his heel and headed towards the elevators, leaving Carlos to finish his work in silence. Little did Charles know that his cruel treatment of Carlos would soon set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. Sarah sat at her desk in the community center, poring over a stack of job listings. She was determined to find employment opportunities for those in need, including Carlos. As she worked, her phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Carlos. "Hey Sarah, I need to talk to you about something. Can we meet up later today?" Sarah quickly replied, "Of course. Is everything okay? I'll explain when I see you. Meet me at the park after work?" "I'll be there," Sarah texted back, a sense of concern washing over her. She hoped that whatever was troubling Carlos, she could find a way to help. Meanwhile, across town, Charles Blackwell was settling into his spacious corner office. He had a full day of meetings ahead, but his mind kept wandering back to his encounter with the janitor in the lobby. Why had he been so harsh? It wasn't like him to lash out at employees, even those in lower positions. Charles shook his head, dismissing the thought. He had more important things to worry about, like the upcoming board meeting where he would present his latest business strategy. With a sigh, he turned his attention to the stack of reports on his desk, pushing the morning's events to the back of his mind. The sun was setting as Sarah arrived at the park, casting a warm glow over the green space. She spotted Carlos sitting on a bench, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the ground. "Hey Carlos," Sarah said softly, taking a seat beside him. "What's going on?" Carlos took a deep breath before speaking. "I had a run-in with the CEO of Blackwell Enterprises today. He humiliated me in front of everyone, mocking my job and treating me like I was worthless." Sarah felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had heard stories about Charles Blackwell's arrogance and cruelty, but to witness it firsthand through Carlos' experience was heartbreaking. "I'm so sorry, Carlos," Sarah said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "No one deserves to be treated that way, no matter their position." Carlos nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know I'm just a janitor, but I work hard and take pride in what I do. To have someone like Charles Blackwell dismiss me so easily, it hurts." Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. She knew that the community had the power to stand up to people like Charles Blackwell, but it would take careful planning and unwavering determination. "Listen, Carlos," Sarah said, her voice filled with conviction. "You are not alone in this. Our community is here to support you, and together, we can show Charles Blackwell the consequences of his actions. It won't be easy, but I believe in the power of resilience and unity." Carlos looked up at Sarah, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You really think we can make a difference?" Sarah smiled, squeezing his shoulder gently. "I know we can. It all starts with small acts of kindness and believing in ourselves. Trust me, Carlos. Change is coming." As the two friends sat in the park, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, ethereal light. It was a moment of calm before the storm, a promise of the transformation that lay ahead. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the community center with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent the night brainstorming ideas on how to support Carlos and others who had been mistreated by those in power. As she entered the building, Sarah was greeted by a buzz of activity. Volunteers were already hard at work, organizing food drives, job fairs, and educational workshops. The energy in the room was palpable, a testament to the resilience and determination of the community. Sarah spotted Carlos across the room, helping to set up tables for the job fair. She made her way over to him, a smile on her face. "Good morning, Carlos. How are you feeling today?" she asked. Carlos looked up, returning her smile. "Better, thanks to you. Knowing that I have the support of the community means everything to me." Sarah nodded, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "That's what we're here for. Speaking of which, I have some ideas on how we can make a real difference, not just for you, but for everyone who has been impacted by people like Charles Blackwell." Carlos raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm all ears." Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. "We start by building each other up, one small act of kindness at a time. We show the world that true power lies in compassion and unity, not wealth and status. And as we grow stronger, we find ways to hold people like Charles Blackwell accountable for their actions." Carlos felt a surge of hope rise within him. "I love it. Count me in, Sarah. Whatever you need, I'm here to help." Sarah grinned, clasping his hand in hers. "Together, we're going to create a movement that even Charles Blackwell won't be able to ignore. Let's get to work." As the two friends dove into their tasks, the community center hummed with a newfound energy. Little did they know, their actions were about to set in motion a series of events that would change the course of their lives, and the life of Charles Blackwell, forever. Across town, Charles Blackwell sat in his office, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was reviewing the latest financial reports, and the numbers weren't adding up. Something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he flipped through the pages, a knock at the door startled him. "Come in," he barked, his eyes never leaving the report. His secretary, a young woman named Emily, poked her head into the room. "Mr. Blackwell, your 2 o'clock is here. Should I send them in?" Charles waved his hand dismissively. "Give me 5 minutes. I need to finish this first." Emily nodded, closing the door softly behind her. Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. The stress of running a multi-million-dollar company was starting to take its toll, and he could feel a headache brewing behind his eyes. Just as he was about to dive back into the report, his phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from an anonymous sender, with the subject line, "The Truth About Blackwell Enterprises." Intrigued, Charles clicked on the message. As he read, his eyes widened in shock. The email detailed a series of unethical business practices, including tax evasion, insider trading, and employee mistreatment. The sender claimed to have evidence to back up their claims and threatened to go public if Charles didn't take immediate action to rectify the situation. Charles felt his heart race as he scrolled through the email. How had this happened? He had always been careful to keep his business dealings above board, or so he thought. If this information got out, it could ruin everything he had worked so hard to build. With trembling hands, Charles picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer. "We have a problem," he said, his voice shaking. "I need you to meet me at the office. Now." As he hung up the phone, Charles felt a sense of dread wash over him. He had no idea who was behind the email or what their motives were, but one thing was clear: his carefully constructed world was starting to crumble, and he had no idea how to stop it. Back at the community center, Sarah and Carlos were deep in conversation. They had spent the morning brainstorming ideas on how to support those in need, and they were excited to put their plans into action. "I think we should start with a food drive," Sarah said, jotting down notes in her planner. "We can reach out to local businesses and see if they're willing to donate." Carlos nodded, his eyes lighting up. "That's a great idea. And maybe we could organize a clothing swap, too. I know a lot of people who could benefit from some gently used clothes." As they talked, the door to the community center opened, and a young woman walked in. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for someone. Sarah noticed her immediately and stood up, a welcoming smile on her face. "Hi there. Can we help you with something?" The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm looking for Sarah Walker. I have some information that I think she might be interested in." Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "I'm Sarah. What kind of information?" The woman glanced around the room, lowering her voice. "It's about Charles Blackwell. I used to work for him, and I have proof that he's been engaging in some pretty shady business practices." Sarah's eyes widened, and she exchanged a look with Carlos. "What kind of practices?" she asked, her voice steady. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. Everything from tax evasion to employee mistreatment. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I had to do something. Sarah took the papers, her hands shaking slightly. She knew that this information could be the key to holding Charles Blackwell accountable, but she also knew that it would be a long and difficult road ahead. "Thank you for coming forward," Sarah said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I promise we'll do everything we can to make sure this information gets into the right hands." The woman nodded, a look of relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Sarah. I knew I could trust you." As the woman left the community center, Sarah turned to Carlos, her eyes blazing with determination. "This is it, Carlos. This is the break we've been waiting for. We have to act fast." Carlos nodded, his own resolve strengthening. "Let's do this, Sarah. For all the people who have been hurt by Charles Blackwell and others like him." Together, they began to formulate a plan, knowing that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with the promise of hope and transformation. The news of Charles Blackwell's unethical business practices spread like wildfire through the community. Sarah and Carlos worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a case against the powerful CEO, reaching out to former employees and whistleblowers who had been silenced for too long. As the community rallied around their cause, small acts of kindness continued to make a big impact. Food drives and clothing swaps provided much-needed support for those in need, while educational workshops and job fairs offered opportunities for personal growth and empowerment. And then, one day, the unthinkable happened. Charles Blackwell was arrested on charges of fraud, tax evasion, and employee mistreatment. The news sent shockwaves through the city as people struggled to come to terms with the fall of one of its most powerful figures. For Sarah and Carlos, it was a moment of vindication, but also a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. They knew that holding Charles Blackwell accountable was just the first step in creating lasting change, and that the community would need to come together like never before to build a brighter future. As the dust settled, Sarah found herself standing in front of a crowd of supporters at the community center. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. "Today, we have shown that no one is above the law," she began, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "But our work is far from over. We must continue to fight for justice, for equality, and for the dignity of every person in our community." The crowd erupted in cheers, their faces filled with hope and determination. Carlos stood beside Sarah, his own eyes shining with pride. Together, we are stronger than any one person or corporation, Sarah continued. We have the power to create change, to build a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. And we will not rest until that world is a reality. As the speech came to a close, the community center was filled with a sense of unity and purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but with each other's support, anything was possible. And so, the community set to work, planting the seeds of transformation that would grow into a movement of hope and resilience, a movement that would change the world, one small act of kindness at a time. In the weeks that followed Charles Blackwell's arrest, the community continued to come together in ways that no one could have predicted. People from all walks of life, rich and poor, young and old, found common ground in their desire to create a better world. Gardens sprang up in vacant lots, tended by volunteers who saw the power of growth and renewal in every seed they planted. Community shops opened their doors, offering everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts, with profits going back into local projects and initiatives. And at the heart of it all was Sarah and Carlos, who had become the face of the movement. They worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going, organizing events and rallies, and inspiring others to get involved. But even as the community grew stronger, there were moments of tension and uncertainty. Some people questioned whether real change was possible, while others worried about the long-term sustainability of their efforts. One evening, as Sarah and Carlos sat in the community center, going over plans for the next big event, they found themselves grappling with these doubts. Do you ever wonder if we're making a real difference? Carlos asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Sarah looked up from her notebook, her eyes filled with determination. Of course we are, she said, reaching out to take his hand. Every small act of kindness, every person who gets involved, it all adds up. We're building something bigger than ourselves, something that will last long after we're gone. Carlos nodded, his own resolve strengthening. You're right. We can't lose sight of the bigger picture. We have to keep pushing forward, no matter what. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sarah and Carlos exchanged a curious glance before Sarah went to answer it. To their surprise, standing on the other side was none other than Emily, Charles Blackwell's former secretary. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting at her sides. Emily, Sarah said, her voice filled with surprise. What brings you here? Emily took a deep breath before speaking. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Something that I think could change everything. Sarah and Carlos exchanged another look, their hearts racing with anticipation. They had no idea what Emily was about to say, but they knew that whatever it was, it would have far-reaching consequences for the community and for the world. Emily sat across from Sarah and Carlos, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I have evidence that Charles Blackwell wasn't acting alone, she said, her eyes darting between the two of them. He was part of a much larger network of corrupt businesspeople and politicians, all working together to line their own pockets at the expense of everyone else. Sarah and Carlos exchanged a stunned look, their minds racing with the implications of Emily's words. What kind of evidence? Sarah asked, leaning forward in her seat. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents, her hands shaking slightly as she handed them over. Emails, financial records, secret recordings, it's all here, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I had to do something. Sarah and Carlos pored over the documents, their eyes widening with each new revelation. The evidence was damning, painting a picture of a vast web of corruption that stretched far beyond Charles Blackwell. This is huge, Carlos said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation. With this information, we could bring down the entire network. Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. We need to get this to the authorities, she said, but we also need to be careful. If word gets out too soon, the people involved might try to cover their tracks. Emily looked between them, her eyes filled with determination. I'll do whatever I can to help, she said. I want to make things right." Together, the three of them began to formulate a plan, knowing that the road ahead would be filled with danger and uncertainty, but also with the promise of justice and transformation. The news of the corruption network hit the city like a bombshell. Arrests were made, investigations were launched, and the community watched in disbelief as some of its most powerful figures were brought to their knees. For Sarah and Carlos, it was a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. They knew that rooting out corruption was just the beginning and that the community would need to come together like never before to build a new foundation of trust and integrity. As the dust settled, Sarah found herself standing once again in front of a crowd of supporters at the community center. But this time, the atmosphere was different, charged with a sense of purpose and possibility. "We have seen the power of unity and resilience," Sarah began, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "We have shown that when we come together, there is nothing we cannot achieve." The crowd erupted in cheers, their faces filled with hope and determination. "But our work is not finished," Sarah continued. "We must continue to fight for a world where every person has the opportunity to thrive, where corruption and greed have no place, and where the power of community is celebrated and upheld." As the speech came to a close, the community center was filled with a sense of renewed purpose. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but with each other's support, anything was possible. In the weeks and months that followed, the community continued to come together in ways that no one could have predicted. People from all walks of life found common ground in their desire to create a better world, one small act of kindness at a time. Community gardens flourished, becoming symbols of growth and renewal. Neighborhood watch programs were established, fostering a sense of safety and connection. And everywhere, people were talking about their hopes, their dreams, and their vision for a brighter future. At the heart of it all were Sarah and Carlos, who had become the leaders of a movement that was growing stronger by the day. They worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going, organizing events and initiatives that brought people together and celebrated the power of community. But even as the movement grew, there were moments of doubt and uncertainty. Some people questioned whether real change was possible, while others worried about the challenges that lay ahead. One evening, as Sarah and Carlos sat in the community center, going over plans for the next big event, they found themselves grappling with these doubts. "What if we can't keep this going?" Carlos asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "What if people lose interest or get discouraged?" Sarah looked up from her notebook, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's not going to be easy," she said, reaching out to take his hand. "But we can't give up. We have to believe in the power of what we're doing, in the power of community." Carlos nodded, his own resolve strengthening. "You're right," he said. "We have to keep pushing forward, no matter what." And so, with renewed determination, Sarah and Carlos set to work, planning, organizing, and inspiring others to join the cause. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that with each other's support, anything was possible. As the months passed, the community continued to thrive, growing stronger and more vibrant with each passing day. The gardens bloomed, the neighborhood watch programs kept the streets safe, and everywhere, people were coming together to build a brighter future. But even as the movement grew, there were still challenges to be faced. Some people remained skeptical, questioning whether real change was possible. Others struggled to let go of old grudges and resentments, finding it difficult to trust in the power of community. One day, as Sarah and Carlos were walking through the streets of the city, they came across a group of protesters, their signs and chants filled with anger and division. "How can you talk about unity and community when there's still so much injustice in the world?" one of the protesters shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Sarah and Carlos. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes filled with compassion. "I understand your anger," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But we cannot let it divide us. We must find a way to come together, to listen to each other, and to work towards a common goal." The protester hesitated, his anger slowly giving way to uncertainty. "The power of community is not about ignoring our differences," Sarah continued. "It's about embracing them, learning from them, and using them to make us stronger. It's about recognizing that we are all in this together and that we all have a role to play in creating a better world. As Sarah spoke, the crowd began to quiet, their signs and chants giving way to murmurs of agreement. And slowly, tentatively, people began to come forward, first one, then another, until the street was filled with a sea of faces, all united in their desire for change. In the end, it was the small acts of kindness that made the biggest difference. The shared meals, the helping hands, the simple gestures of love and support, these were the things that brought the community together, that gave people hope and strength in the face of adversity. And as the years passed, the community continued to thrive, growing stronger and more resilient with each passing day. The gardens flourished, the neighborhood watch programs kept the streets safe, and everywhere, people were coming together to build a brighter future. For Sarah and Carlos, it was a testament to the power of unity and resilience. They had started with a simple idea, that by coming together, they could create something bigger than themselves, and they had watched as that idea had grown into a movement that was changing the world. As they stood together in the community center, surrounded by the faces of those they had come to know and love, Sarah and Carlos knew that their work was far from over. There would always be challenges to face, obstacles to overcome, and doubts to conquer. But they also knew that as long as they had each other, and the power of community behind them, there was nothing they could not achieve. Together, Sarah said, her voice filled with hope and determination, "We can do anything." And as the crowd erupted in cheers, their faces filled with joy and celebration, Sarah and Carlos knew that truer words had never been spoken. For in the end, it was the power of unity, of love, and of hope that would carry them forward, today, tomorrow, and always.